The truth was locked away until now.
She stood at the wire, barefoot in the mud, watching the convoy roll in. American trucks. Olive green, clean. The woman beside her whispered something. A prayer, maybe. Or a curse. It didn't matter anymore. Words had lost their weight here. What remained was the body, lice-ridden, hollow-eyed, wrapped in a coat 3 sizes too large. What remained was the smell that no longer registered because it had become her. For 2 years, she had not bathed. For 2 years, she had not been seen as human, and now, these men in pressed uniforms stepped down from their trucks, and one of them said something that shattered her entirely. "You can take a hot bath now." She didn't move. She didn't believe him. April 1945. Bavaria, a valley the war had forgotten. The camp sat between 2 hills, hidden by pine forests from the main road. It was never meant to be found, never meant to matter, just another footnote in the vast bureaucracy of the Third Reich. A detention facility for German women. Not Jews, not foreigners, Germans, women who spoke too loudly, women who loved the wrong people, women who refused to raise their arms in salute. The wire had rusted orange over 2 winters. In some places it sagged so low you could step over it, but no one did. The women inside had nowhere to go. No families waiting. No homes left standing. Some tried to leave when the guards fled 3 days earlier. Their bodies were found a kilometer down the road. Collapsed in ditches, clutching fence wire in their frozen hands, the ground was black. Not with earth, but with waste. With rot. With bodies that gave up. The spring thaw had turned the camp into a swamp of filth. The smell would make survivors gag even decades later. It was the smell of unwashed bodies, of overflowing latrines, of lice and infection and death that came too slowly. She stood at the fence, gripping the wire with hands that no longer felt pain. Her name was Greta Hoffman. 32 years old, though her body could belong to a woman of 60. Before the war, she taught piano in Munich, Chopin, Debussy. She had students who loved her. She had a husband who did not. In 1943, she hid a Jewish girl in her cellar for 6 weeks. A neighbor reported her. The girl was sent east. Greta was sent here. She had not bathed in 23 months, none of them had. And now, through the broken gate, the Americans were arriving. The rumble started as distant thunder rolling through the valley. But it wasn't thunder. It was engines. Diesel engines. American engines. The trucks rolled through the shattered gates, tires crunching over broken wood and rusted wire. The sound was alien here. Mechanical. Powerful. Alive. For 2 years, the only sounds in this place had been coughing, crying, and wind through the barracks. Now the air filled with the growl of motors, the hiss of air brakes, sharp commands in a language most of these women didn't understand. The trucks halted in the center of the yard. Doors swung open. Men stepped down onto the mud. They wore clean uniforms. Their boots were polished. Their faces were young. Impossibly young. But their eyes were old. They had seen Dachau. They had seen Buchenwald. They thought they had seen everything. They were wrong. 187 women stood throughout the yard watching. They didn't rush forward, didn't cry out in relief. Relief was a reflex they'd unlearned long ago. Instead, they stood motionless, silent, eyes tracking every movement with the wariness of beaten animals. Some were barefoot. Some wore wooden clogs that clicked hollowly on frozen mud. All of them were filthy. Their hair, what remained, was matted and crawling with lice. Their clothes were rags stitched from blankets, burlap sacks, dead men's uniforms. Their skin was gray, stretched tight over bone, marked with sores that wouldn't heal. The youngest was 16, the oldest 63, but they all looked the same. Ageless, sexless, erased. A young American officer stepped forward. Lieutenant James Patterson, 24 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania, where nothing bad ever happened. He'd joined the Army in 1942 because it was the right thing to do. He'd killed men, watched friends die, walked through camps where bodies were stacked like firewood. But standing here, looking at these women, these German women, enemy women, he felt something crack inside him. He turned to the translator. A German-American corporal whose grandmother still wrote him letters in Gothic script. "Tell them the war is over," Patterson said quietly. "Tell them they're under American protection now. Tell them we have food and medicine. The translator stepped forward and called out in German. His voice echoed across the silent yard. The war is over. You are under American protection. We have food and medicine. No one moved. Patterson shifted his weight, uneasy. He'd rehearsed this moment in his head a dozen times, but nothing prepared him for this silence. This stillness. He looked at the faces staring back. Hollow. Suspicious. Afraid. And he realized that words meant nothing here. They'd heard words before, promises, lies, so he said something else. Something unscripted. Something human. Tell them they can take a hot bath. The translator hesitated. It sounded absurd, almost cruel. Offering a bath to women who hadn't seen soap in 2 years, who'd forgotten what clean skin felt like. But he translated it anyway. You can take a hot bath now. And that's when Greta Hoffman broke. She didn't collapse slowly. Didn't sink gracefully to her knees. She simply dropped, as if her bones had turned to water. And she screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain. It wasn't a scream of joy. It was something else entirely. Something primal and raw. A sound torn from a place so deep she didn't know it still existed. It was the sound of a soul that had been holding itself together with wire and willpower, suddenly realizing it no longer had to. Her hands clawed at the mud. Her body shook. The scream became a sob, then another scream, then a keening wail that rose and fell like a siren. And then it spread. One by one, the women around her began to cry. Some sank to their knees. Some stood frozen, tears streaming down faces too exhausted to contort with emotion. Some laughed, high, broken laughter that curdles into weeping. Others made no sound at all, mouths open in silent howls, bodies trembling. It was a wave of grief so vast, so sudden that the Americans instinctively stepped back. Some turned away. Some stared, paralyzed. One young private from Ohio who'd lied about his age to enlist began to cry himself. Patterson stood in the center of it all, watching. And he understood he hadn't freed them. He'd reminded them that they were still human, and that was unbearable. History remembers the camps, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. The names are carved into stone, into memory, into the collective consciousness of the world. But history is selective. It remembers the largest atrocities and forgets the smaller ones. It remembers the victims it can categorize and overlooks those who don't fit the narrative. German women who resisted. German women who helped. German women who spoke too loudly or loved the wrong people or simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were sent to camps too, not death camps. Not extermination centers, labor camps, detention facilities, re-education centers with bureaucratic names and official paperwork. Places designed not to kill but to erase, to remove them from society, from history, from memory. By 1945, there were dozens of these camps scattered across the dying Reich. Small facilities barely guarded as the front lines collapsed. In the chaos of Germany's final months, they became ghost sites. Places where the guards fled, the Red Cross never arrived, and the prisoners were left to rot in administrative limbo. This camp in Bavaria had no official name. In documents, it was referred to simply as Work Camp South 17. It had been established in 1943 on the grounds of an abandoned agricultural estate. The barracks were built by the first inmates, women arrested for political crimes, for aiding enemies of the state, for moral offenses, teachers who refused to inform on students, nurses who treated Jewish patients, mothers who hid deserters, wives of executed conspirators, women who listened to foreign radio broadcasts, women who made jokes about the Führer, women whose only crime was knowing someone who committed a crime. 347 women were registered here between 1943 and 1945. By April 1945, fewer than 200 remained. The others had died of typhus, dysentery, starvation, exposure, despair. The guards fled on April 26th when they heard American artillery in the distance. They took the remaining food supplies with them. For 3 days, the women had been alone, locked inside a camp with open gates, too weak to leave, too afraid to hope. And then the Americans came. To understand what happened when the Americans arrived, you must understand what came before. Winter, 1944. The camp was already 2 years old. already established in its rhythms of cruelty and survival. The women woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of a handbell. They had 15 minutes to use the latrines, open pits surrounded by wooden planks, then assemble in the yard for roll call. Roll call lasted an hour, sometimes 2. They stood in rows, barefoot in the snow, while the guards counted and recounted, checking names against lists, searching for reasons to punish. If someone was missing, sick in the barracks, dead in the night, everyone waited until she was found or accounted for. After roll call, there was breakfast. A ladle of watery soup, a piece of black bread the size of a fist. No coffee, no milk, just lukewarm water in a tin cup shared among 5 women. Then work. Some were sent to the fields to dig potatoes from frozen ground. Some were sent to the workshops to sew uniforms for soldiers who were already dead. Some were sent to the quarry to break rocks for roads that would never be built. The work was pointless, and everyone knew it. It existed only to exhaust, to degrade. To occupy, they worked until noon, another ladle of soup, then work until dark. Dinner was the same as breakfast: soup, bread, water, then the barracks, wooden buildings with no insulation. No heat except what rose from the bodies packed inside, bunk beds stacked 3 high, each shared by 2 or 3 women. Thin blankets crawling with lice, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies. Of sickness, of slow death, there was no privacy, no dignity. The latrines were open pits. The sick lay next to the healthy. The dying lay next to the living. When someone died in the night, and someone always died in the night, her bunkmates left her there until morning roll call, because her body provided warmth and there was no bathing. In the first months, there had been a pump in the yard where women could wash their faces, their hands. But the pump froze in the winter of 1943 and was never repaired. After that, there was nothing. No water for washing, no soap, no towels, just the slow accumulation of filth, layer upon layer, until it became part of them. The lice came first, then the rashes, then the infections, then the fevers. Typhus swept through the camp in January 1944, killing 40 women in 3 weeks. The bodies were buried in a trench beyond the wire. No markers, no prayers, just dirt. By the winter of 1945, the women had stopped counting the dead. They'd stopped counting anything. Greta Hoffman arrived at the camp on November 3, 1943. She remembered the date because it was her daughter's birthday. Anna would have been 7. She didn't know where Anna was now. The Gestapo came for her on a Thursday morning. She was giving a piano lesson to a little boy named Klaus who struggled with rhythm, but loved Beethoven. There was a knock on the door. 2 men in long coats, very polite, very calm. "You need to come with us." She asked why. They didn't answer. She asked if she could call her husband. They said no. She asked if she could pack a bag. They gave her 5 minutes. She never saw Klaus again, never saw her home again. She was taken to a Gestapo office in Munich, interrogated for 6 hours and transferred to the camp the next day. The charges were never formally read. The trial never took place. She simply disappeared into the bureaucracy of the Reich. One more name on one more list. The first night in the camp, she slept on bare boards in a barracks with 60 other women. Some cried. Some prayed. Greta lay silent, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how her life had ended so quickly. In the morning, she learned the rules. No talking during roll call. No sitting during work. No refusing orders. No complaining about food. No asking about release dates. No letters. No visitors. No hope. She learned other things too. She learned that hunger is not a sensation but a presence, a constant companion that follows you, whispers to you, shapes every thought. She learned that cold is not discomfort but pain, pain that lives in your bones, that never fades, that you carry even in summer. She learned that filth is not a state but an identity, something that seeps into your skin, your hair, your mouth, until you can't remember what clean felt like. She learned that the body can endure far more than the mind believes possible. And she learned that the mind, in response, begins to shut down. By the summer of 1944, Greta had stopped dreaming. By the fall, she'd stopped remembering Anna's face clearly. By the winter, she'd stopped imagining a future. She existed only in the present, the next roll call, the next meal, the next night, because anything beyond that was unbearable. She stopped being Greta Hoffman, piano teacher, mother, daughter. She became prisoner 1127, and prisoner 1127 didn't need to be clean. There's a moment, perhaps 3 or 4 months into captivity, when a woman stops noticing the smell. At first it's unbearable, the stench of sweat, of unwashed bodies packed into tight spaces, of menstrual blood with no way to clean it, of festering sores, of rotting teeth, of waste. It invades everything, clings to your clothes, your hair, your breath. You gag, you retch. You press your face into your sleeve and try to breathe through fabric, but the body adapts. After a few months, the smell becomes background. Your nose stops registering it. Your brain filters it out. You no longer notice that you reek, that everyone around you reeks, that the very air is thick with human decay. This is survival. This is how the mind protects itself. But it comes at a cost. When you stop noticing the filth, you stop being disgusted by it. And when you stop being disgusted by it, you stop being disgusted by yourself. You stop caring what you look like, what you smell like, whether there's dirt under your nails or lice in your hair. You stop recognizing yourself as someone deserving of cleanliness, of care, of basic human dignity. You become the filth. This is what the camps did, intentionally or not. They didn't just imprison the body, they eroded the sense of self. They took women who had once bathed daily, who had once cared about their appearance, who had once taken pride in clean clothes and neat hair, and they reduced them to creatures who could no longer imagine being clean. By 1945, the women in Camp South 17 had been filthy for so long that they'd forgotten what it meant to be anything else. And then the Americans told them they could bathe. The Americans worked quickly. Within 2 hours of arriving, they'd set up a field bathing facility in a barn half a kilometer from the main camp. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't comfortable, but the water was hot. They used canvas tarps, repurposed fire hoses, and diesel generators to create a makeshift shower system. 6 shower heads, steam rising in the cold air, the smell of soap. Real soap, American soap, cutting through the stench of the camp. Medics and nurses were stationed nearby. They'd been briefed. They knew what to expect: malnutrition, disease, lice, open sores, psychological trauma. But knowing and seeing are different things. The first group of women, 20 of them, including Greta, were led from the camp to the barn. They walked slowly, shuffling through the mud in wooden clogs or bare feet. Some leaned on each other for support. Some walked alone, eyes fixed on the ground. An American nurse stood at the entrance to the barn. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, from Boston, 26 years old. She'd treated soldiers with limbs blown off, with faces burned beyond recognition. She thought she was prepared. She wasn't. The women stopped at the threshold, staring at the steam, at the shower heads, at the stacks of towels and bars of soap. No one moved. No one spoke. Lieutenant Brennan stepped forward and said gently in broken German, "It's safe. The water's hot." Still, no one moved. Greta stood at the front of the group, her hands clutching the edges of her Wehrmacht coat. Her eyes were locked on the shower heads, and her breathing had become shallow, rapid. She was trembling. Lieutenant Brennan approached her, slowly, carefully, the way you'd approach a frightened animal. "You can go first," she said softly. Greta shook her head. "It's okay. It's just water." "Just a bath." Greta's mouth opened. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then finally, in a hoarse whisper, "I have forgotten." Brennan didn't understand. Forgotten what? Greta's eyes filled with tears. How to be clean. It wasn't Greta who went first. It was a younger woman, perhaps 19, with a shaved head and a scar running from her temple to her jaw. Her name was Ilse. She'd been arrested for distributing anti-war pamphlets in Frankfurt. She'd been here since the summer of 1944. She stepped forward suddenly, without warning, and walked into the bathing area. She didn't hesitate, didn't look back. She simply moved. The other women watched. Ilse stood beneath one of the shower heads, still fully clothed. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she reached up with a trembling hand and pulled the cord. Water poured down. Hot water, clean water, water that steamed and hissed as it struck the cold fabric of her coat. Her dress, her skin. Ilse didn't move. She stood there, fully clothed, water pouring over her, and she began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears streaming down her face, mixing with the water, washing away months of grime. Slowly, the other women began to move. One by one, they stepped into the bathing area. Some pulled the cords immediately. Some stood for long minutes, staring at the water before they could bring themselves to touch it. Greta was the last to enter. She walked to the farthest showerhead, away from the others, and stood beneath it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the cord. She pulled it. The water hit her like a blow. Hot, almost scalding. It soaked through the Wehrmacht coat, through the ragged dress beneath, through the layers of newspaper she'd wrapped around her body for warmth. It ran down her face, into her eyes, her mouth. It tasted like metal. It tasted like life, and then slowly Greta began to remove her clothes, the coat first. It fell to the ground with a wet slap. Then the dress, a shapeless gray thing stitched together from burlap. Then the strips of newspaper. Then the underwear, rotted and falling apart. She stood naked under the water, and for the first time in 23 months, she saw her own body. She was unrecognizable. Her ribs protruded like the bars of a cage. Her stomach was concave. Her breasts had disappeared. Her skin was mottled with sores, with bruises, with the tracks of lice bites. Her legs were skeletal. Her feet were black with filth that the water couldn't immediately wash away. She looked down at herself, and she didn't know who she was. But the water kept coming. Hot, relentless, washing away the filth. The lice, the dead skin, washing away 23 months of degradation. She picked up the bar of soap, real soap, white and clean, and she began to scrub. It happened slowly, then all at once. At first, the women scrubbed mechanically, methodically, as if performing a task. They washed their arms, their legs, their faces. The water around their feet turned black, then brown, then gray. The smell of soap filled the barn, cutting through the stench they'd carried for so long. But then, one by one, they began to break. A woman named Hilda, who once worked as a seamstress in Berlin, suddenly sank to her knees under the water and began to sob. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She clutched the soap to her chest like a lifeline and rocked back and forth, keening. Another woman, younger, began to laugh, high, frantic laughter that echoed through the barn. She scrubbed her arms until they were raw, until they bled, laughing the entire time. Ilse, the first to enter, stood motionless under the water, her eyes closed, her lips moving in what might be prayer or might be a conversation with someone who wasn't there. And Greta, standing alone at the far end, began to scream, not a scream of pain, a scream of rage, a scream of grief, a scream for every day she spent filthy, for every night she lay in her own waste, for every hour she forgot what it meant to be human. She screamed until her voice cracked, until her throat was raw, until there was nothing left, and then she collapsed. Lieutenant Brennan rushed forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Greta was shaking violently, her body racked with sobs. Brennan held her there in the water and let her cry. "It's okay," Brennan whispered, though Greta couldn't understand the words. "You're safe now. You're safe." But Greta wasn't crying because she was safe. She was crying because she'd remembered what it felt like to be clean, and remembering meant confronting what she became when she was filthy. The bathing took 3 hours. Group after group of women were brought to the barn, 20 at a time, until all 187 had passed through the water. Some emerged quiet, subdued, wrapped in clean American blankets. Some emerged numb, staring at nothing. Some emerged still crying, unable to stop. None of them emerged unchanged. The Americans set up a medical station in one of the barracks. The women were examined, deloused, treated for infections and malnutrition. They were given clean clothes, oversized U.S. Army shirts and pants, socks, underwear. They were fed, carefully. Broth, bread, nothing too heavy for stomachs that had shrunk to the size of fists. And they were. Documented Lieutenant Patterson insisted on this. He'd seen too many camps where the dead were nameless, where the survivors disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. He ordered his men to take down names, ages, hometowns, to photograph each woman, to create a record. Greta sat for her photograph 3 days after the bath. She was wearing a clean shirt. Her hair, what little had grown back, was combed. Her face was still gaunt, still hollow. But there was something different in her eyes. She was looking at the camera, really looking. Not through it, not past it. She was there. The camp was liberated, but liberation wasn't freedom. The women had nowhere to go. Munich was a ruin. Berlin was rubble. Hamburg was ash. Their homes were destroyed. Their families scattered or dead. The infrastructure of Germany had collapsed. There were no phones, no mail, no way to search for loved ones. The Americans established a displaced persons camp in a nearby town. The women were moved there in trucks, given beds in a former schoolhouse, provided with food and basic medical care. They were told they could stay as long as they needed. Some stayed for weeks, some for months. Some never left. Greta stayed for 4 months. During that time, she learned that her husband had been killed in an Allied bombing raid in 1944. She learned that her daughter, Anna, had been sent to live with relatives in the countryside and had survived the war. She wrote letters. She waited. In August 1945, she was reunited with Anna in a Red Cross processing center in Stuttgart. The girl was 8 years old now. She didn't recognize her mother. Greta knelt down in front of her, took her small hands, and said, "It's me. It's Mama." Anna stared at her with wide, uncertain eyes, and Greta realized that the war had taken more than years. It had taken the woman she was. The mother Anna remembered was gone. In her place was someone else, someone thinner, harder, older, someone who bathed in cold water every day since liberation, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the memory of filth. Someone who still, sometimes, woke in the middle of the night and couldn't remember what clean felt like. After the war, the world wanted to move on. The camps were documented. The perpetrators tried. The victims mourned. But the narrative was selective. It focused on the Holocaust, on the Jews, on the industrialized murder of millions. The smaller stories, the camps for German resistors, for political prisoners, for women who defied the regime, were filed away. Not forgotten exactly, just set aside. Greta's story was never told. Not in books, not in documentaries, not in museums. She lived until 1989, dying quietly in a small apartment in West Germany. Her daughter inherited a box of papers, faded photographs, handwritten letters, a worn identity card from the displaced persons camp, and a single bar of soap, wrapped in brown paper. Never used, Anna asked her once years later why she kept it. Greta looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and said simply, "So I never forget what it meant when they gave it to me." To understand what happened in that barn in Bavaria in April 1945, you must understand what a bath meant. It wasn't just water. It wasn't just soap. It was the recognition of humanity. For 23 months, these women had been treated as less than human. They'd been starved, beaten, degraded, left to rot. They'd been stripped of their names, their dignity, their sense of self. They'd become numbers, bodies, problems to be managed, and then an American lieutenant standing in the mud said 6 words, "You can take a hot bath." It was a simple gesture, an act of basic decency, but in that moment, it became something more. It became an acknowledgement that they were still human, that they still deserved care, comfort, cleanliness, that they still mattered. And that acknowledgement, after so long without it, shattered them, because to be seen as human again meant confronting what they'd become when they were not. It meant remembering who they were before, and remembering is the hardest thing of all. In the weeks after liberation, the women struggled in ways the Americans didn't anticipate. They couldn't sleep in the clean beds. They felt too soft, too safe, too undeserved. Some slept on the floor instead. They couldn't eat the food. Their stomachs, shrunken and damaged, rejected anything richer than broth. They vomited. They cramped. They suffered, and they couldn't stay clean. This was the cruelest irony. After years of filth, after finally being given the chance to bathe, many of the women became obsessed with cleanliness. They bathed twice a day, 3 times, scrubbing their skin until it bled. They washed their clothes constantly. They couldn't tolerate the slightest speck of dirt, the faintest odor, but no matter how much they scrubbed, they still felt filthy, because the filth wasn't just on their skin. It was in their memory, in their dreams, in the way they saw themselves. A psychiatrist attached to the American Medical Unit documented this phenomenon. He called it the trauma of cleanliness. The women, he wrote, had been conditioned to associate their own bodies with degradation. They'd spent so long being filthy that cleanliness felt foreign, almost wrong. Some reported feeling exposed, vulnerable, unsafe when they were clean. Others reported feeling guilty, as if they didn't deserve to be clean, while others remained imprisoned, remained filthy, remained dead. One woman told him, "I look in the mirror and I don't know who I am." The filthy woman was real. This clean woman is a stranger. Lieutenant Patterson was haunted by the camp for the rest of his life. He returned to Pennsylvania in 1946, married his high school sweetheart, worked as a school teacher for 37 years. He never talked about the war. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. But every year, on April 29th, the day he arrived at the camp, he would lock himself in his study and write letters. Letters to women he'd never met, whose names he didn't know, whose faces he couldn't forget. He never mailed them. After his death in 1998, his daughter found a box containing 43 letters, all addressed to the women of Bavaria. In one, he wrote, "I thought I understood war. I thought I understood cruelty. But I didn't understand what it meant to strip someone of their humanity so completely that offering them a bath would break them. I didn't understand that kindness after prolonged degradation can be more painful than cruelty. Because cruelty you expect. Kindness you've forgotten exists. And when it returns, it reminds you of everything you lost." The camp in Bavaria was never famous. It never appeared in history books. It wasn't liberated by famous generals or documented by famous journalists. It was simply one more small horror in a war full of them. But for 187 women, it was everything. It was the place where they lost themselves, and it was the place where, in a barn filled with steam and the smell of soap, they began the long, impossible journey of finding themselves again. Not all of them made it. Some couldn't carry the weight of what they'd become. Some couldn't reconcile the clean woman in the mirror with the filthy woman they'd been. Some couldn't forgive themselves for surviving when others didn't, but some did. They rebuilt. They remembered. They lived. And every time they stepped into a bath, into a shower under running water, they remembered that April day in Bavaria when an American lieutenant said 6 words that changed everything. "You can take a hot bath." It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind them that they were human. And sometimes in the ruins of war, that's all you need, a reminder, a moment of warmth, a single act of kindness that says, "You matter, you are seen, you are still here." Greta lived for 44 more years after the war. She never played piano again. She said her hands had forgotten. But sometimes, late at night, her daughter would hear her humming Chopin, Debussy, the music she'd taught to students whose faces she could no longer recall. She never spoke about the camp. Not in detail, not with specifics. But once, near the end of her life, she said something to Anna that stayed with her forever. "The worst part wasn't the filth," Greta said. "It was forgetting that I deserved to be clean. That's what they took from us. Not our bodies. Not our freedom. Our belief that we mattered. And when the Americans gave us that bath, they gave us more than water. They gave us permission to be human again. And I cried because I'd forgotten I was allowed." She paused. "I still cry sometimes. When the water is hot. When I remember." Anna asked her what she remembered. Greta smiled. A sad, distant smile. "Everything," she said. "And nothing." If these forgotten echoes of war move you, subscribe. We bring the unseen side of history back to life.